Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Turk, and I'm the director of the Center for Free Expression at Ryerson University, and I'd like to welcome you to today's panel. I would like to begin by acknowledging the land on which I am welcoming you today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. This is the fourth in the Center for Free Expression's weekly visual forum series. The topic for today's panel discussion is, has our fear of offending gone too far? I want to thank the co-sponsors of today's panel, which is PEN Canada. We greatly appreciate their co-sponsorship. Before beginning, I'd like to share with each of you the format for today's discussion. I'm shortly going to be introducing our panelists and our moderator, whom you will see as I introduce them. After about 45 minutes of discussion amongst themselves, the moderator will turn to you, the audience, for any questions you may have for the panel. If you'd like to ask a question, if you look down at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A button. So at any time during the discussion, if a question comes to mind, simply click on that Q&A button and type in your question. Your question will go to Ange Holmes, who's the center's coordinator, and will be collecting the questions, and then we'll be reading them to the panel when the moderator turns to the audience. You'll also see right next to it a chat button. Please do not use that. That's been disabled for the duration of this conference. The panel discussion is being recorded, and a video recording of it will be on the podcast page of the Center for Free Expression's website, as well as on the events page. So for this, for anyone who would like to refer others to this panel discussion or to see any of our previous ones, the three previous ones, you can go to the Center for Free Expression website, which is cfe.ryerson.ca. I would like to take a moment finally to express appreciation to several people. One is to Ange Holmes, the center's coordinator, who does an enormous amount of work to make these panel discussions possible. And I'd also like to thank Brian Bowes and Luke Nader from Ryerson University's Media Services. Their technical expertise has been and continues to be invaluable to us. And finally, I'd like to remind you that the next in our series, the fifth panel, will be next Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 8 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, June 2nd. And the title of it is it time to re-examine the limits on workplace free expression? Now, allow me to introduce the panelists. The first panelist is Lydia Perović. Lydia is a Canadian journalist and author who grew up in Montenegro in the former Yugoslavia. She moved then to Belgrade in 1992 for a BA in journalism and political science, and where she worked as an intern for the last independent daily newspaper struggling to survive under the Milosevic regime. She subsequently moved to Canada, where she completed an MA in political theory at Dalhousie University before taking up residence in Toronto in 2005. Her work, her writing has been published in a variety of publications, including the Los Angeles Review of Books, Book Forum, The Believer, Ms. Magazine, N+1, The Globe and Mail, the Literary Review of Canada, and Partisan. She's published two works of fiction and is working on a third book currently, a nonfiction account of the immigrant experience and belonging and the difficulties around that, and her experiences about how Canada and Toronto have changed since 1999. Welcome, Lydia.
Thank you.
Our second panelist is Sonya Fatah. She's an assistant professor in the School of Journalism at Ryerson University. In addition to her teaching, for the past 2 years, she has co-led the Ryersonian and the Ryerson Review of Journalism. Most of Sonya's working life as a journalist was spent overseas in India and Pakistan, covering South Asia for Canadian and US publications, including the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, the Boston-based Global Post, now PRI. She wrote a column on India-Pakistan issues for the Times of India, which by circulation and readership is the largest paper in the world. She continues to write occasionally on Indo-Pakistani issues for the Globe and Mail. So Sonya is really multi-talented. She also writes audio and video documentaries, and has had features published in Fortune, the Columbia Review of Journalism, the Walrus magazine, amongst many others. She, with colleagues, is doing research on diversity in the Canadian media and on the impact of journalism training on marginalized communities. And finally, she's also the editor-in-chief of JSource. So welcome, Sonya.
Thank you.
Our third panelist is Abbas Kassam. Abbas is a Toronto-based lawyer practicing intellectual property litigation. He is also a senior fellow of the Center for Free Expression. Abbas graduated with a law degree from the University of Toronto and was previously a judicial law clerk in the Federal Court of Canada. Abbas sits in the board of directors of a local homeless youth shelter and is on the advisory board of the National Council of Canadian Muslims. Welcome, Abbas.
Thanks, Jim.
And finally, our moderator, who has to be really distinguished to be able to moderate a discussion with such interesting panelists. Lisa Taylor is an associate professor and undergraduate program director at Ryerson University School of Journalism. She holds a JD and a Master of Laws degree from the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University. She's a former practicing lawyer. She's a member of the Law Society of Upper Canada and of the Nova Scotia Barrister Society. She's written extensively on issues related to the intersection of law and journalism ethics, including serving as co-editor of the book, The Unfulfilled Promise of Press Freedom in Canada, which is a collection of scholarly essays published by the University of Toronto Press in 2017. Lisa frequently appears on media reports as an expert commentator on matters related to freedom of expression and journalism ethics. A former CBC radio and television journalist, Lisa's award-winning work includes a Gemini nomination, a B'nai B'rith Media Human Rights Award, and the Best of Festival Prize from the Yorkton Film Festival. She continues to lead professional development workshops for CBC journalists across the country. Finally, Lisa chairs the Canadian Association of Journalists Ethics Advisory Committee and leads the Canadian Worlds of Journalism Study Team, which is an interdisciplinary group that together with researchers from 70 countries regularly assesses the state of journalism throughout the world. Lisa is a senior fellow of the Center for Free Expression. So Lisa, I turn this over to you and look forward to the discussion of you and your panel.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for setting things up so well. You know, there's so many wonderful things about moderating a panel for the Center for Free Expression, and most notably, it would be the ideas that are unpacked and the wise minds that tackle these issues. But it's also really incredible how much work you do. You do so much of the heavy lifting before the moderator even steps in. I always find it's kind of like you've set the table and all we have to do is kind of sit down and feast. So that's what we're going to do. And I'd like to start with Lydia. Lydia, you wrote a recent piece for the Literary Review of Canada entitled, "Shut It Down, Our Fear of Offending Has Gone Too Far." And in that you posit that in Canada, the time, and I'm going to quote you to you, when the left will see hate speech in every disagreement, while the right will continue to rule the world. And you ground that argument in part in your experience as a journalist in Serbia in the late 1990s. What are the parallels?
Well, I try not to exaggerate the parallels, but they have been emerging on my horizon, which is why I wrote that piece. I don't know if either of you knows, there's a Wanda Sykes special on Netflix right now called "This Is Not Normal," and where she lists how her life and how American life is changing under Trump. And you're wondering if you're crazy or the world's going crazy. So basically, this is my version of "This Is Not Normal." And I kind of go, I have like a half a dozen cases, then half a dozen from the US. And was I looking at the US? Because, I mean, what happens there, it affects us a lot. I mean, they sneeze, we get coronavirus. So, Okay, terrible joke, I know. So about a year ago, about 10 of us working in the arts and writers and so on met in a pub to discuss. It was just around the time that Sky Gilbert's play was removed due to something he said on his personal blog. We met to discuss whether we're all experiencing similar things or whether we're going crazy. And the response was incredible. We had about 20 people interested in meeting to discuss stuff that they've been encountering. And about 10 of us showed up. And it was a wide cross section of people. It was, yeah, it was all ethnicities, it was all ages, and everybody had stories to share. Somebody was shut down because at a panel because somebody told her she wasn't oppressed enough, so she can't discuss a certain topic. Another person had a conversation with a granting officer who told her, well, that work is very traumatic. You need to put a good spin. You have to put something positive in it and stuff like that. So we all had stories of this kind. And we thought we would form sort of a loose coalition of artists and writers against censorship. And only about 4 people decided to put their names under it. Everybody else feared retaliation of some sort. One was a young choreographer who didn't want to burn bridges. Another one was a co-artistic director who didn't want to get the other co-artistic director in trouble. So that was very strange to me. Then in Canada 2018, somebody doesn't want to come and say, yeah, I'm on principle, I'd like to be part of this coalition against censorship for the arts. So all these things made me write that article.
So with that example, Lydia, you've pointed out the idea of whether or not people feel like they should stand up and respond to censorship. And I want to take that idea of when you stand up and respond and kind of bring it to you, Abbas. And I'm thinking about, given your lived experience as well as your experience as a board member of the National Council of Canadian Muslims, what is the calculus? Abbas, what is the kind of mental calculus involved with deciding whether or not to respond to discriminatory or to hate speech?
Thanks, Lisa. So I like to break it down into 3 kind of different groups of people when it comes to some form of offensive speech. There's the person or the people that agree with the person who is propagating offensive speech. There's the individual or community that's on the receiving end of the offensive speech, and then there are those that are probably indifferent or don't care or are not paying attention. So like you said, I have experience kind of working with communities that are on the receiving end of offensive speech. So the calculus a lot of the time is to try and shut down speech. That's the natural inclination. And for a lot of kind of, I'd say, rational, maybe not reasonable reasons. For example, I work a lot with the Muslim community, and when we get these broad accusations leveled at a community as a whole, which puts us in the awkward position of trying to prove negatives or trying to prove things where the evidence and the bar to the evidence is so high that you can't even meet it. So the natural inclination in those situations is to try and kind of shut down that offensive speech. And that's done because the people on the receiving end of that offensive speech view that as a identifiable win. If you have someone who's propagating offensive speech and you manage to deplatform them, that's an identifiable win. If you manage to get them to lose their job, that's an identifiable win. The calculus being that this form of punishment should work as a deterrence for future actors. Like most things, punishment or fear of punishment is not a very good deterrent. So the angle that I like to pitch is, let's look at it from the angle of the person propagating what is allegedly offensive speech. If you shut them down or cause them to lose their livelihood, will that make them, for example, change their opinion? Probably not. They may double down on that opinion. They may, issue an empty apology. And what gets lost in this is you don't get the chance to actually engage in what the offensive speech actually is. Like all offensive speech, there's some nugget probably of truth, and a lot of it may be rhetoric that's incorrect or based in ignorance that you don't really get to engage with. So you take that person and the people that agree with that person, and you kind of make them the martyrs, and that causes people who weren't paying attention maybe to pay attention, or for the people that agree with that speech to put this person on a pedestal and make them a martyr. The other problem with this is it also drives rhetoric underground. So if you say that this is unacceptable in a certain sphere, this is offensive speech, that may push, that doesn't change that speech, like I said, but pushes that speech underground, which lets it boil and makes it maybe boil up in a very dangerous way, as we've seen in recent history.
And Sonya, thinking about, Abbas is speaking about the idea of when we respond to speech, when we just kind of let it slide, when we have something that may be offensive speech, what is the kind of mainstream or legacy media decision-making about, do we call attention to what may be an injustice, or does that give offensive speech too much oxygen? I mean, there seems to be a tension in journalism in that regard.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks, Abbas and Lydia. I just wanted to quickly, just also before responding to your question, Lisa, is also just responding quickly to this, the topic of discussion today, which is, has our fear of offending gone too far? And I just want to say that I think it's important that there's a nuance in this, even in asking that question. So I would say my immediate response at some level is yes, but it depends on where you're talking about, right? Because in social media, which I think is one of the most offensive places alive, there doesn't seem to be a lot of fear of being offensive. And launching viral attacks against individuals, communities, and so on. But I mean, I come to this conversation with a specific interest in two areas. One of my primary focus, of course, is to look at the role of a journalist and journalism organizations, as you pointed out. But then a secondary consideration is also looking at the role of the educator and the role of the university. And I know we'll come to this over the course of this conversation. But I think that it's very difficult to have this conversation about individual acts of, either to ban somebody's speech or ability to speak. I think we have to kind of push out and look at it from a sort of a larger structural point of view. And to that, I would say some of my work is just looking at the sort of state of diversity in the Canadian media. And by diversity, I mean, not just talking about gender and race, I'm also talking about, disability, inclusion of various kinds of perspectives, I think, because the key here is looking at how organizations, media organizations, respond to critical issues and how they pass through the complications of those issues. And I think if you don't have a critical team of people really thinking about why is this issue in the public's interest, and how should we respond to it and report on it, I think you often have a missed opportunity to have to really be able to tackle and bring that issue to the table. So I think journalism organizations, some of them do have clear sort of ideas about what is hate speech and what is forbidden on their channels or on their websites or in publications. But I think oftentimes what we see happens after the case of publishing, right? It happens in the social media space, and people react to what has been published. And I think some of those reactions are coming from a lack of really critical thinking about how to present some of these issues and why we are not recognizing certain things as being deeply insensitive and problematic. So they may not hit the bar of hate speech per se, but they are building on an established practice of framing issues, of issues around source diversity, around issues of whose voice and who's taking up the oxygen around a conversation. And I think that's the kickback we see, or the response we see in social media, is people responding to that failure of our system to really change the real challenging issues. for instance, the judicial system, the media, who's reporting on media, and we can talk about the Tina Fontaine case later on. So social media becomes that weaponized space so people can say exactly what they want because they're seeing that it's not impacting the way we live and the way we think and work and produce content around key issues.
So I just want to follow up on one thing about that. Are you suggesting then that, I know so all too often I look at social media and just think, oh, people just do better. Well, in order for that to happen, is it that the mainstream news media have to first do better? Is that the connection?
Yeah, I think it's not, I think it's, to me, I think part of what we are seeing happening in the social media space is a reflection of a failure of other systems to do the work that they should be doing. So, the expectation for us as journalists is that we have robust systems of accuracy and fact checking, and we develop these systems and we train our journalists in the future to be aware and to think through all these critical issues before you press publish, before you send it to a printing press or put it on air. And I think in many cases, particularly cases where, journalists rely on other systems and structures, and those structures are also problematic. So I think the failure to really address those things is part of the reason why we are dealing with this crisis right now in social media.
So the social media crisis that Sonya is referencing, Lydia, I'm thinking in the context of social media and in kind of mainstream news media. You come to this from the perspective of an arts and culture journalist. How is this discussion about what is or isn't offensive speech shaping arts and culture journalism today?
In several different ways, things are changing, for example, in arts criticism and in theory of literature, who is allowed to say what. There was a really good essay by Zadie Smith recently on why in fiction in particular, she didn't look at other arts forms, but in fiction, if we take seriously the idea that nobody's allowed to write outside their own ethnicity, it would basically mean the end of fiction. And she says, well, if we as a society find that there's some higher goal than that, sure, let's have this discussion. But let's be aware what that means. If only we have to write, I'm only allowed to write about Montenegrin immigrant lesbian women who are reaching middle age, for example, or that kind of stuff. And those discussions have started to rage, and they've started to rage in opera as well, where a lot of people are now asking questions, why is non-Japanese soprano singing Cho-Cho-san? Or why is a non-Métis singer singing Louis Riel? So that's one side of the debate. Another one is whether to offend, whether a group of people offended a group of, whether you created something and it offended a certain group of people who are very upset about it, whether that's a reason to unpublish something, for example. And I'll remind everybody of the American Dirt, which was the latest American scandal in American publishing. One of, they're beginning to accumulate, the Woody Allen one and all that. But the publisher there stood its ground, but canceled a book tour. So there was effect of that. They said, okay, we're not going to unpublish a book written by a non-Hispanic about a Hispanic story, but we're gonna not do this. So and of course opinion pieces like the one that Dale Peck published about presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg upset so many people on left and right that the New Republic just said this is going to have to go. And that's a very interesting precedent because the US has, I think it has stronger protection for offensive speech than we do, for example, or that the UK does. So yeah, that's and then there's been conversations in theater, for example. There's been a couple of theater plays in Canada. One has toured. Very upsetting pieces, but many argued really good theater, extremely upsetting. A lot of people were unhappy that people may be triggered as the parlance have it. So it's basically conversations like that, whether we're re-traumatizing, whether we're stealing somebody else's culture and who's allowed to say and do what.
When I think about the trauma that may be experienced by people who come up against speech that they feel is offensive or that is hate speech directed at them, Abbas, I can't help but I hear the logic in your argument that says all we do is drive this underground, or we teach people to put on their nice public face and still continue to think they're hateful things. But for people who have been subject to hate speech regularly, hearing, oh, please, just more education, more love, more tolerance, sure, this will fix things. That's a tough sell for really good reasons if you've been subject to hate speech multiple times. What do you do to make that resonate, or to kind of get people to meet you where you are with this?
Oh, it's definitely a tough sell. I 100% agree with that. I think it depends on, I think we make a distinction between a particular individual and then like a community. If it's a particular individual that is being consistently attacked or the subject of hate and offensive speech, it can be extremely tiring. And for that, I think there's specific legal ways of going around dealing with that. But if it's at a community level, I like to look at it historically. So when you have, for example, a minority community, when they're new in a place where they are now a new minority, they may not have the tools or the background to respond right away to that offensive speech, but they will slowly develop them. And I think we can look at, for example, two classic examples in the States, which has, as Lydia said, very strong protections for what could be considered offensive speech. We can look at the Black community and their civil rights activism, and you'll find many of their classic kind of their civil rights icons, whether it's Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, or even their lawyers, excuse me, such as Thurgood Marshall. They were all strong proponents of free speech, and they used speech to their benefit. Now, mind you, those individuals, are coming, after hundreds of years of history in the United States. So it does take time, but I think it actually, from again, this is my opinion, it actually works to strengthen a community, and diamond is made under pressure, as the common statement goes. And I've seen that even within my own community. Like a lot of people made a joke in around 2015 that Stephen Harper was great for the Muslim community, not because of his politics, not because of his policies, but because he forced that community to organize, to get together, to get their act together, and develop tools and skills to deal with whether it's offensive speech or advocating for better policies. And I realize that that's probably a very difficult thing for people to hear, to be on the face of oppression. I'm not advocating oppression by any stretch. I'm just saying that the answer is to try and counteract that speech.
I get overall what you're saying about that, but in order to kind of have people start to organize and respond, I mean, people had to put up with an awful lot of thinly veiled, kind of faux polite Canadian, barbaric cultural practices, to quote Mr. Harper. That's a lot to listen to.
It is a lot to listen to, and it's difficult to fight that rhetoric. And I think to be frank with you, I think Stephen Harper was probably the most difficult politician in the world to fight that rhetoric from, because he appeared reasonable. Whereas you look at the rise of the right since Stephen Harper globally, they're not as, at least don't try to come off as nuanced as he did. I think it's easier to look at Trump and his Muslim ban. It's very prominently offensive, and I don't know what to say except for we have to keep doing it. We have to keep working, because the counterfactual in that, if you try and shut down that speech, if you try and shut down people like, I don't know, Stephen Harper or Donald Trump, you are just going to it's an incendiary tactic for their followers to just continue that. And it is a bit counterintuitive, but I think historically that's been the most effective kind of response to offensive speech.
Can I interject quickly?
You sure can.
I'm a very unlikely person to say anything positive about Stephen Harper's regime, but I will, because during Stephen Harper's regime, I became a citizen, and I've experienced both liberal-run immigration system and conservative-run immigration system. And I have to say, conservatives fixed a lot of things that the liberals just kept postponing and postponing and postponing. So I have to say one plus goes to them for that, because effectively the permanent residence system during the last liberal years, during the sponsorship scandal, when they got a little bit smug, it was just a disaster. You have to wait 3 or 4 years for anything to be processed. But conservatives did fix that, so credits were due. But I was just going to say a couple of things about the term hate speech and the isms and phobias. I used to use those quite a lot in arguments, but now that I observe people abusing them, like everybody has some ism, we so easily use, oh, you're a racist. That's the end of the conversation. Or I agree with you, you're homophobic. Like the recent studies and documentations have been coming out whether the concept of homophobia is actually still useful for us who live in the West. So and why is it, in which way is it not useful as a sort of tool for liberation, as a tool for fighting the oppression? So whenever I can, I try to avoid using those grim words in conversation because they end the conversation. And also there's disagreement between oppressed groups. So for example, you have disagreements within various oppressed groups about whether certain speech is hate speech or not. So that complicates it a little bit. I mean, we all remember the big hoopla around Meghan Murphy renting a room and a couple of other women at the Palmerston Library. And one of the most often heard thing is that she's using hate speech. Nobody's ever sued her for any hate speech. There was no proof that that was hate speech. But the thing just became a currency. And hate speech, nobody checked whether actually she was engaging in hate. So I think we should be slightly more careful. Having said that, yes, hate speech exists, but we just need to fine tune and not abuse the accusation of hate speech.
Just to remind people about Meghan Murphy, she was her issue was with trans women, yes?
No, she is a radical feminist. So, and occasionally a lot of people are radical feminists, and a lot of feminists are radical feminists. And I agree with some respect, some things that they say, and I don't agree with some other things that they say. And so the question is whether, for example, male-bodied trans women should be allowed in female sports, because we recently had cases of late transition male-bodied trans women deciding they want to do sports in a category that they've never practiced before and achieving significant results. So people have started noticing that, well, fine, but what do we do with that? And also Canada and other countries have had inmates in prisons, male, completely male, have committed crimes as male, deciding that in prison that they're women and they want to transition into female estates. So, I mean, this is a legit question to ask. I don't think this is hate speech, but there are people who would actually tell me what I'm saying right now is hate speech. So anyway, there's a lot of those people, and they protested outside the library where those women gathered to discuss these issues.
Sonya, as I listen to Lydia unpack these issues and tackle the vagueness and contradictions that reside within the words that we try to use to express complex ideas, I think about all that complexity handed to, not to be ageist about this, but quite often a young or at least relatively inexperienced journalist who is asked to take something as nuanced as the idea that Lydia just presented, pull it down to an 8-second clip, put it in a story that runs no more than 2 minutes, and also play the game of, well, on one hand, and then the other hand, which gets into a matter of equivalencies. What's the kind of packaging of these complex discussions or disputes? What does it look like in the hands of mainstream media? And how can
sorry, I didn't hear the last bit.
and how can they do better, or can they do better?
Right.
Is the medium just too blunt?
Yeah, I mean, there's short-term approaches to the problem that you're highlighting, and then there's the longer view, which I'm always more invested and interested in. But I mean, I want to just respond to what Lydia was saying, and I agree there is an abuse of terminology. You know, I mean, I see this all the time. I hear my kids say all the time, you know, you said something racist, or you said something sexist. So there is a general tendency to not always comprehend the sort of importance of the statement or the word, the ism. And I think that is partly because that's what people are seeing and responding to, particularly in an online space. But I think in a media newsroom, and I think that part of the challenge for journalists is that they are responding to news as it breaks, certainly for breaking news journalists or anyone in the daily news journalism business. And it becomes very challenging in this day and age where there is a shortage of beats, you know, a shortage of staff in newsrooms, people doing general assignment reporting on the quick, and not having the institutional memory of either the incident or the issue or of the newsroom's practice around it. I think that those challenges are very serious and real, and should be at the heart of all conversations around rescuing journalism and keeping the value of it alive today, right? So I don't think to me, I don't see easy solutions to those kinds of really big, you know, editorial and structural problems that we have in the industry today. But I think at the same point, I think that part of that is the role of journalism schools, right? As we prep students to go out in the workforce, and where there isn't that kind of on-the-job training that may have happened historically because a senior editor took you under their wing and kind of exposed you to a story and its history and whatever else had happened. I mean, I say that at the same time, I'm acknowledging that there are problems in the newsroom in terms of how that story would have been reported historically as well. So that doesn't take that out of the equation. But, you know, I mean, I think that, you know, come back to the conversation of having representation in the newsroom, people who can speak to different perspectives, people who can speak to why something is problematic and how to write around that. And I'm not at all saying what, you know, Lydia's, your response to the issue of, you know, censoring people's ability to speak is a genuine problem today. And I see that in, you know, the culture of what we say wokeness, right? Saying the right thing for the right reason, but not necessarily practicing it. I mean, I see that is a genuine problem today, that people will say the thing they're expected to say, but, you know, how they behave or how they interact and how they live does not reflect that reality. So, I mean, I'm not opposing what you're saying, Lydia, but I just am adding that level of my own practical perspective in terms of journalism and media today. And so, I mean, I want to bring up the Django Meshi piece, because we talked a little bit, I want to talk about the Ian Baruma firing around that story. And I think part of the problem in even analyzing that decision, if everyone knows, Ian Baruma was the editor-in-chief of the New York Review of Books, and he was the editor at the time when he decided to publish a piece from Django Meshi. It was his first major piece after trying to reinvent himself after court proceedings against him for major allegations of sexual misconduct. You know, that's an interesting story, because if you read the piece, Lydia, remind me, what was your adjective for that piece?
Treacly.
Yes, treacly. Okay. I think it's more than treacly. I think it's inaccurate in many places. And if you think about the role of an editor, what is the role of an editor? An editor's role is to make sure that they are presenting facts, even if it is somebody else's opinion. They are meant to check in and say, well, hey, are you sure that is an accurate representation of what happened? And I don't think there was a hell of a lot. And interestingly, the conversation around Ian Baruma's firing centered around, you know, he was fired because he should never have let that piece be published. Whereas I think a more a more accurate or more focused conversation on his firing should have been, what is an editor's responsibility, and what practices in terms of framing, editing, in terms of ideas that you're putting out in the public space does an editor have, or should an editor respond to? And I think that was certainly a failure. And I think that there's another point there around his firing, which was that I don't think Ian Bremmer went through the traditional editorial process with that piece. I mean, there is a reason why he didn't bring in the regular editorial team to the table, or I can assume that there's a reason, because he knew there would be a response or a reaction or a debate or more clarity required. So, I mean, I would look at that kind of thing, not from a point of the suppression of free speech, although the conversation certainly goes in that direction once that happens. And I do know that in this case, we are talking about the power of audience, right? And it is audiences that are driving this whole conversation, because
advertisers in this case too.
Exactly. Well, advertisers react to audiences, right? So the advertiser relationship is entirely based on if people start to walk away from a brand because they think a brand is supporting. And that was the case with the New Yorker's event where we're going to have a conversation with where Remnick was going to interview Steve Bannon, and the New Yorker decided to cancel that event because educational institutions that support the New Yorker were threatening to pull out. So I think this question about audiences is really key to the whole issue. But I would say that the role of the journalist and the role of the institution is to go much more beyond the basic idea of free speech. But it is, what is your role as a journalism organization? What is your role as an educational institution to facilitate these conversations? Is it just about platforming it? Because if it's just about platforming it, I think that's a problem.
Yeah, I don't think they start by saying, oh, let's just platform anybody. I don't think that was their reason for inviting, for example, or for Hachette for publishing Woody Allen, or for Muruma asking Gomeshi, who's not a writer. Like that's the one tack I would take when questioning his decision, is just a bad writer. Whatever possessed you? I mean, it's a magazine where Mary McCarthy wrote, and Hannah Arendt, and so dumb. But I'm interested in the fate of an editor who perhaps make a mistake. I don't know if he made a mistake. I'm not privy to editorial meetings with the New York Times. If there was inaccuracy, a lot of people publish inaccuracy. A correction could have been forthcoming. Just think it's an interesting and odd precedent for a publisher to be for a editor to be entirely removed from the job because of one thing.
I mean, I agree with you. Sorry, Lisa, can I quickly
close the loop?
On this is that I'm not saying that I agree with firing him necessarily.
Okay.
I'm highlighting that there was a serious editorial failure in not the decision well, I mean, as you point out, the decision to even have a non-writer in the New York Book of Reviews. Why, right? And is that just a hunt for the greed for audience? I don't know what that was, what was informing that, or a decision based on support for an ideological point of view. I don't know. But I think that is one. And the second is, I think corrections are something you do really regretfully, not as a practice.
Absolutely, yeah.
Practice should very much be to make sure that your editorial processes are in place and that you are being factually accurate.
Yeah. But last thing.
Well, yeah, sure.
We should just keep in mind that Jian Gomeshi was exonerated. He wasn't convicted of anything. So that's...
No, I'm moving this on because for a bunch of reasons. Fascinating, but for a bunch of reasons.
I mean, we may not like it, but
I want to get us to the point of coming back to some Canadian examples, because as robust an opportunity as we have to critique how these conversations unfold in the US, we have enough of our own to go around, I swear. And one of the common points that I heard between you two, Lydia and Sonya, is this idea of how quickly advertisers or publishers, all in the name of doing the right thing or being woke, or quite often just protecting their own bottom line. And we saw that similarly in a recent case involving a school chair from the Peel District Board here in Canada. Again, we have enough examples of our own. He was removed from his school council chair position, and also fired by his employer, a real estate company, after he made what could easily be perceived as an Islamophobic comment on social media. And the tweet was in response to a decision by the city of Brampton to allow, during Ramadan, the evening call to prayer to be broadcast, given that coronavirus restrictions made it impossible for people to gather to pray together. So Ravi Huda had made a tweet about, it was one of those classic "what's next" kind of tweets, which you often argue, what's next? Next, we'll have a separate lane for goats and camels, and I forget what other offensive tropes that he trotted out. So Ravi Huda lost his job as a result of that single tweet. By many standards, it was an ugly and intolerant tweet. So Abbas, I'm wondering, did Mr. Huda get his just desserts by being canned both from his community volunteer position and his professional position as a result of an offensive tweet at a very difficult time?
Yeah, I had a lot of problems with this story. Yeah, Mr. Huda's speech, which his tweet in response to the tweet from Patrick Brown, the mayor of Brampton, saying that they're going to amend bylaws to allow the adhan, which is the Muslim call to prayer, to be permitted during certain hours at certain decibel levels. And he responded directly to that tweet, and I'll just read it out so that everyone has the context. He responded, "What's next? Question mark. Separate lanes for camel and goat riders, allowing slaughter of animals at homes in the name of sacrifice, bylaw requiring all women to cover themselves from head to toe intends to appease the peace fools for votes." So it's an offensive tweet, sure. I don't, maybe I'm giving him too much credit, but I don't actually think he's suggesting that Patrick Brown will actually create another lane for camel and goat riders. I've ridden a camel before as a Muslim, as all good Muslims have, and they wouldn't survive very well in Canada, I can tell you that. But the tweet was definitely offensive. And then there were activists within the community that kind of went after Mr. Huda. And eventually he lost his seat on the Peel school. He's lost his seat as the Peel school council chair, which you could make an argument that, having offensive views to a minority, and there are significant Muslims definitely in Peel region, is directly linked to taking on a role as a school chair where you have maybe funding decisions relating to, for example, multiculturalism policies. You could make that case. I think I make that case, but you could make that case. So perhaps he may be fit for the school council chair. The appropriate remedy probably would be to vote him out. But you could make the case that he should he's unfit for that position. But his job, his livelihood, I don't think that's an appropriate punishment, and it makes me very uncomfortable, this sort of mob justice. So if you get enough people who are upset about something, his employer, Remax Canada, like he said, he was a real estate agent. If you get enough, enough people who are upset about it, and they go to a business and say, hey, if you keep this guy employed, you must be agreeing with what he said on Twitter. I don't necessarily think that's true. And I think that's very difficult, and it makes it difficult for people like Mr. Huda or people that agree with Mr. Huda. The next real estate agent that, is a bit of an Islamophobe, he's just not going to tweet it, and then you don't even know. I think that it's very dangerous. I think the better response would have been to deal with him directly. Now, he did issue an apology. I don't know how sincere that apology is. I don't like to judge the sincerity of apologies, but he did issue an apology. But I think it's very dangerous when the gut reaction to something offensive is punishment instead of perhaps education, perhaps to add nuance to an issue. I think it's a very dangerous proposition, and you're put in a situation where, let's say that there is something offensive, whether that's going to be acceptable in the public sphere will become a function of how unpopular or popular it is with either a group of people or a company, and that's not how we resolve issues relating to speech or relating to any civil rights, for that matter.
It becomes sort of a PR manager for the company rather than something else, education and so on. I remember there was a person who worked for Toronto Hydro, I think, maybe I'm misremembering, who was caught on camera yelling what young males usually yell at female reporters in sports events and whenever they see a female reporter. And so people recognized him and named him and sufficiently shamed him, and then lost. So I thought, wow, good, he lost. But then when I thought about it, I don't know if that was necessary. And then I'm thinking, when the company then gets all this bad PR and they decide we're just gonna, I mean, that's exactly what the investment firm did with the deranged Central Park woman, I think, because it kind of became a PR problem for them. So they said, no, we're firing. So yeah, it's interesting. It's all these layers of questions.
Forgive me, Lydia, I'm not sure if I'm talking over
You hear me?
You're frozen.
Hello?
Hi,
Yeah.
Lydia. You were frozen there. I'm going to move on just for now. And I'm sorry, I didn't.
Am I back?
Yes, you are back. You were last talking about Amy Cooper, lost her job at Franklin Templeton after.
Good. Okay. I did everything I needed. Okay.
Sonya, in mainstream media, when they cover these visceral discussions around identity and speech that is offensive, I feel like there's I'm a journalist, we are often very quick to resort to the fighting fish model, the just one side or the other. I don't hear a lot of voices like sentiments like what we just heard from Abbas, the whole idea of, yeah, that is damn wrong. And yeah, someone should not lose their livelihood. Their family should not suffer. We should reach out. Is it because we like news stories that go like that? Where is the middle ground in exploring these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of the challenge is that daily newspaper journalism doesn't allow a lot of space for, or daily journalism doesn't allow a lot of space for nuance if people are on deadlines and have to report. But I think it comes back to this question of how many stories does a journalist have to report in a day? Do they have time to really piece through the narrative, find more sources, try and talk to more people, bring the nuance in? Or is it easier to have a headline that is going to get clicks and is sort of more black and white in terms of, I mean, it's the reason why Donald Trump, not to use an American example again, but why does he make headlines? Because he uses this really simple, easy, divisive kind of speech, right? That makes it really easy to report and get clicks on. But if you get into the nuances of reporting on him, it's much more challenging to keep the reader or the audience on the page, you know? And I think that is an inherent challenge. I think that is exacerbated by the fact that we have journalists who are under a lot of pressure to report, and again, may or may not, may be very green in terms of their understanding of that issue, and may not have had time to build connections with communities where they would have access to more sources. So they will go to the easiest people who they're most used to hearing from, people who are in the media, who are quoted. And it's the thing we talk about in journalism school and in a lot of classes is source diversity. Make sure you're not just going to the easiest person you reach, but then there's a function of time and all of those factors as well. I also think, I mean, in terms of the example you gave around the Peel board, I think that you know, someone who is in a position of authority that directly affects a whole range of young people who are going to school, you know that those kinds of, even if it's a single comment, you know that it's underlying a larger issue, which means that if someone is publicly putting a response like that out, they have other things to say. And they may not just be about Muslims, they may be about other people and other communities and other issues and class and so on. So I think it really gets to the whole question of hiring and who do you have in your teams. And And how are you really investing, whether at the school board level, at the university level, at the journalism organization level, at the scientist level, who are you hiring? And I think hiring is a really important part of this question, because what social media is doing, it is making people somewhat accountable, maybe too accountable, which is what we're saying, right? They're too accountable for what they're saying. But I think the fact that we're talking about this mass reaction does not in any way diminish the very important fact that people expressing these views and then being in positions of power and authority where they have the ability to crush people out or give more power to somebody else. This is a question of power, I think. And I don't think that that should be separated. So what could have happened to him if he wasn't fired? He should have been demoted, and he should have gone through trainings, and should have had to demonstrate through some kind of reviews over time that he is, and part of that could have been an investigation that the board does. How often has he made comments like this in the past, quietly, in school board meetings, and not things where the camera is on you or you're in a public forum. So I think that there is some amount of accountability required when people decide to flail out on social media, and maybe people have emotive reactions, so they react in the immediate. They haven't censored or self-censored themselves, which is why it is so naked and useful to look at people's social media, because they're saying what they really believe,
Can I follow
Or they're
up on
polarized.
Abbas, I would love for you to follow up. I just want to signal one thing to our coordinator, Ange Holmes. We'll be with you very soon for audience questions, if indeed there are audience questions. But Abbas, yes, and then I will go to you, Lydia, before we bring in the audience.
I agree with what Sonya is saying. I wonder if, well, first of all, I'm not sure someone has certain offensive ideas when you hire them or when you vote them into some sort of position, unless they've obviously communicated that in the past. So some people hold latent ideas that are offensive. Once you discover that idea, what do you do? I think you need to make a distinction between if it's related to the job and their ability to do the job, then either some training needs to get done. I'm a little hesitant to fire them the first response to something, because then it creates a situation where you're basically only looking for almost infallible people to fill a role. And you're not allowing change and growth to happen. And I think for me, the net result for when faced with offensive speech isn't to shut it down. It's to get to a point where we can talk about that particular issue, that particular speech, and try and get to the truth. And there are certain people that just hold offensive ideas, and it may not, you're very uncomfortable with it, but it may not affect their ability to do a job, right? There's an example I was reading recently, the book Black Klansman, which is a Spike Lee movie. I don't know if this scene shows up in the Spike Lee movie, but in the book, the main character, who's an African-American gentleman who was undercover as a KKK officer, he meets another person in the KKK who's a firefighter, and he asks him basically, would you save a black person from a dying building, even though you think all of these offensive things about black people? And he said, yes, 100%, because my belief in the tenets of being a KKK member do not interfere with my ability to do my job. Now, if I knew a member of the KKK was in the fire, it was in a certain fire department, it would be grounds for dismissal, I think. But we have to leave room for nuance. We have to leave room for not requiring infallibility for a certain job. You have to leave room for change. If you become the arbiter of what's the right idea or a wrong idea and tie livelihood to it, you're going to end up suppressing a lot of ideas, some of which may be decent, some of which are awful.
Yeah.
Just
I
to draw I just want to ask, I'll get to you, Lydia. I just want to say that, Abbas, you had just, one of your critiques of Sonya's last comment was the idea, well, how can we really know what someone is thinking? And that's where we are with your example of the firefighter. Does the firefighter, who's a member of the KKK, say that because what is in his heart, or does the firefighter, who may also be a member of the KKK, say that because he knows that's what keeps the paycheck running?
Well, this was an interesting distinction because he said it within the confines of a KKK meeting to all other white people. So he didn't have to necessarily, to all other members of the KKK, he didn't have to necessarily, I think, from what I remember in the book, maybe I'm wrong. And, we have, as a lawyer, we have ways of measuring credibility. But for sure, there you can question someone's credibility. But, and maybe even experience. Has he done this before in the past?
Okay. Thank you. Lydia, quick response from you, then we're going to go to questions, and I'm sure the audience will give you guys more opportunities to develop these ideas further. Yes.
Sure. I'm of two minds when it comes to whether social media represent the person in any accurate way. I mean, I spent way too much time on Twitter. I've been trying to leave for ages. The thing is, the bloody thing is optimized for flame wars and for polarization and for assertion of group identity. And people say the dumbest things just for likes and retweets, which they would never say to an actual person standing, nor would they think it if they were talking to an actual person standing in front of them. So the technology is optimized. The Twitter is optimized for dehumanization, for not recognizing the other person as a real, for getting points with your own group. So I think that spurs a lot of our behavior on Twitter.
Thank you. Sorry, once again, I lost a little part of that. I don't know if it's my signal or yours. Oh, it's mine. It tells me the internet is unstable. Guys, if I freeze at any point, just please pop in and carry forward without me. In fact, I've got a ringer now. I've got Andrew, coordinator for the Center for Free Expression. And if I do freeze or somehow disappear, will you just keep the questions from the audience going? I believe we have a couple, and I'll let you ask the first one.
Yes, that's fine, Lisa. Yeah, I have a question from Ro. And Ro says, I hear references to hate speech and offensive speech in the same context. Could the panelists clarify the difference? I feel being offensive is an individual right as well as being offended. Clarity on what is illegal versus what is just bad mean. Ignorant behavior may help.
If the questioner hasn't posed that to anyone in particular, I'd like to at least start with Abbas. I think having kind of the legal distinction there would be helpful, and then I'd count on Sonya and Lydia to kind of fill in the kind of more well-rounded perspective on this.
Sure. So offensive, you can look at hate speech as a subset of offensive speech. Offensive speech being a speech that offends a particular person or a community. Hate speech, I think the way that I use it, would be rising to the level where it brings on some sort of legal liability. And you can look at the criminal code. There are, hate speech provisions. For example, 319 of the criminal code says everyone who, by communicating statements in any public place, incites hatred against an identifiable group, where such incitement is likely to lead to a breach of the peace. So that's kind of the legal definition under that provision of the criminal code. And this is, I'd suggest that rising to the level of hate speech depends, if you're looking at it legally, on the context. A lot of the time, you can look at human rights codes as well for guidance on that matter as well. But if you look at it, the Canadian, I think it helps to contrast the Canadian approach to the American approach. The American approach is a lot more lax. They have a lot more protection for freedom of speech, whereas in Canada there is less protection.
That's I really appreciate that, the distinction that you've created there. And looking at the Canadian context in particular, Sonya, how do you distinguish between what is offensive versus what is hate speech? How do you see that?
I mean, I think hate speech, and it's a good question to ask, so thank you. I would see hate speech as something that is insightful, right? Something that is inciting a reaction or a response against a community. And I think where the area that we are peddling in is more often in the area of offensive speech or ideas that are offensive to communities, which, taken to another degree or level, can morph into absolute hate speech. But I think that where I think the gray area, which is offensive speech often, is the part that we need to spend more time focusing on. And I think that's where we're talking about, where I would say that we end up focusing on an incident or a situation, or should she have been fired or should she have not been fired. And I think that completely sidetracks the conversation. The real conversation is if we talk about, for example, someone like Amy Cooper, and I know I'm sort of taking this opportunity to dive back into an old issue we're discussing, is it's not just about the fact that this one incident happened, and it's not just a simple incident. I mean, that's a very significant incident. It's about, well, a lot of these industries or a lot of these places are have people who can exist in the day-to-day and share certain views. And I'm going to give you an example. When the Justin Trudeau Blackface scandal happened, we have a lot of journalists in Canadian media newsrooms who are people of color and who found it very difficult to basically exist in the mainstream Canadian newsroom around that time, because they had to be party to listening to a lot of people kind of just laughing it off and saying, oh, well, I did that when I was 19, or, so not really addressing the issue of why is this a problem, or should the Prime Minister be in blackface, and how should we respond to this question, which is a structural problem in terms of, the son of a Prime Minister who has, is the father of multiculturalism in Canada. But really talking about what's happening within these institutions, who occupies these roles, and what are these the people who, when discussing and debating how to write about these issues, have the capacity to sort of, not the capacity or the lived experience to really think through how to prevent something that is offensive from being peddled in the public sphere.
Thank you. Ange, can you give us another question, please?
Can I add something?
Oh, yeah, yes, absolutely, please.
Just a quick one. I think I of course defer to lawyers about this, but I looked recently up the Wikipedia page of Canadian cases of hate crime, when there was very few convicted, because the legislation is such that it's not really loose. You can't just you can't just come up with an accusation. You'll have a bit of a time proving that something is hate speech. I'm interested in when it was introduced, because it's a relatively new thing in our legal system, I think. And before that, I guess people had to rely on defamation laws and things like that. So yeah, that's what I'd recommend. It's a very elusive thing between offensive and hate, and there's some legal parameters and some precedents, but there's very little at this point. Yeah.
And very little to unpack the nuance and innuendo that often perhaps delivers the ugliest or most offensive of messages. And we will take another question now, please.
Hi there. Yes, we have a question from Lenny. And Lenny says, Canada's Charter protection for free expression is based on recognition of it being essential for democracy, that the majority at any point in time cannot shut down views it does not like, except in extreme instances such as violent expression, threats of violence, or speech that is so hateful that it subjects an identifiable group to vituperation or vilification that renders them as despicable, beneath contempt, as subhuman. How do we preserve our open democratic society while dealing with the expression that we strongly dislike or find deeply troubling?
I'm not going to do the predictable thing and take this back to the lawyer yet again. Lydia, you were starting to develop the idea around, how can we as citizens define hate speech? So is that a question you're comfortable with responding to?
I don't know if I have enough legal background, but I guess we have to learn it by doing. One of the things that I put in my article is basically you move from a country with an eventful history, move to Canada so you can relax and do your arts, do your writing, and think, oh, this, I'll just take these freedoms for granted. And actually, both in countries with eventful histories and in countries like Canada, everything is always up for grabs. So if this generation decides we don't want to have fiction anymore, the next generations will have to deal with that. If this generation decides, or these two generations, 2 or 3, however many are running things, we're going to expand what hate speech is very, very much more, then deal with it. So, I mean, everything is up for grabs, and it is a valid question. How do we keep a democracy alive while also recognizing there's some very ugly speech around?
Abbas, how much latitude can we give this speech to ensure that our democracy balances these almost by times contradictory democratic fundamentals?
I think it's about maintaining the access to speech. So I think democracies have survived historically where there is free speech. Like that's the lifeblood of democracy. I think what the difference is now, which is a different problem than historically, has been that we have so much speech. Like you look at social media, there's like what, billions of tweets. I don't even know what the numbers are, but there's everyone gets their opinion out there. I think we maintain our democracy by maintaining commitment to democracy and commitment to freedom of expression. So that means trying to limit the suppression of speech. Again, it's about, I think it's about trying to get to truth at the end of the day. We get to truth not by becoming arbiters of truth, but by allowing the historical record to allow nuance and to allow complication of facts. And I think Edward Said said, when faced with Orientalism, the best response is to complicate. You have to complicate issues. You have to add nuance. Now I understand, Twitter is not a great place for nuance. 140 characters or less, don't add much nuance. But if the response is, it cannot be to not have nuance and then to just propagate and to prop up ideas that lack nuance. Like you can look on Twitter, a lot of times there's like two sides to an issue. It's like a competition for retweets. And a lot of people are saying the same thing and there's no real nuance. And I think that's dangerous. I don't think you shut down social media. That's not what I'm suggesting. But I'm suggesting is we have to get to a point where we add nuance, we complicate, we allow that access for people to propagate their speech.
Well, I think over the past 24 hours, Donald Trump has started to talk about shutting down social media, so this may all be solved. And could we take another question, please?
Yeah, this one's from Carolyn. And Carolyn says, the claim that we have just heard, I think this kind of speaks to what you were just talking about. The claim that we have just heard is that social media is optimized for dehumanization. This is, in my opinion, not fair. It also plays a powerful role in humanization, just as other mediums do. So could you please ask the panelists to think of the flip side in regard to the two uses we've just seen this week? Christian Cooper, for example, captured offensive speech to help us all deal with its ramifications. And that's powerful humanizing use of social media.
Lydia or Sonya, I would put this to either of you.
Yeah, I wasn't saying social media bad to cool, like nothing's good about social media, but there are some features in there that don't really make us into a better people. So yeah, I'm absolutely not in favor of shutting down social media, but we have to be aware when we tweet something just so we can appease a group or get tweets and retweets and likes, and when we really have thought about it. So what Abbas and Lisa described as thinking something through, looking at different perspectives, something that the press used to do, but there's less and less of it now. As Sonya will tell us, the political economy of newsrooms. So while there's less and less press, there's more and more chatter.
And I'll just add there, if that's okay.
So we'll see where that takes.
Sonya.
Yeah, so I think what you were saying, Caroline, is it? I think that that is absolutely accurate. And I think for journalism, social media has been a very powerful tool in the sense that there are a lot of reporters look to social media spaces to enhance their access to sources and to get at stories in different ways, right? So both Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, these are all spaces where younger journalists and mid-career journalists and and those who have a comfort and familiarity with social media use these as ways to build a community of sources and to find out what's happening. And I think some really great stuff in terms of debates and questioning has come out of social media. And I would say here also that I think when we talk about audiences, I think there's greater accountability in journalism today to some extent, because your audience is beyond your typical box, right? So your typical, for example, Toronto Life reader in the Canadian context may have been a sort of semi-wealthy upper middle class person who's subscribing to that newsstand copy, but now everyone's reading Toronto Life. So if you're writing about real estate and in a really cavalier way, you're going to get some responses that say, hey, this story needs a ton of nuance and we're going to help you get there. So I think there's a great value to social media, but I think in the context of this conversation where we're talking about offensive speech, I think that it was in that context that we're talking about some of the challenges that you know, a 160 word limit on a tweet provides. So absolutely, I mean, there's no question that that has been a benefit to the reporting process.
Okay. Before we take another question, I just want to apologize. I think Lydia or Sonya, I believe I spoke over one of you. I had quickly muted my video and my audio because I was shutting down someone's social media use, and that was a teenager in my house, because I think that's why my bandwidth has a problem. So I have played my own part in shutting down social media discourse today. I don't know if that makes me part of the problem or part of the solution. Ange, could we take another question? I'd love to get as many questions from this audience as I possibly can.
Yes, so the next question is from Sai, and Sai asks, how do each of you think we should combat sexism, racism, xenophobia, etc.?
Wow. And, and we'll do that 40 characters starting with you, Abbas. Solve it all. Go.
I'm not sure I can answer in, you know, how much time do we have? I think it depends on the historical context of each of them. Like even within racism, for example, like it depends on which race is facing the racism. You have to take a contextual approach, add context, add nuance. I think the example of social media, I think we were kind of being hard on social media, and I agree with the last commenter's point. It's opened up a lot of space for certain facts that have always existed to be documented. So if we look at police brutality against the Black community in the state, it's not, you know, a lot of people are saying it hasn't changed over time. What's changed is the access and availability of social media to show that this is in fact happening. So if we look at that Amy Cooper incident in New York, that was an interaction that probably has happened, you know, thousands of times before. But the difference is you now have someone showing that it happens, and it allows for a public discourse in that regard. So my overall answer to answering to battling any of these is to add context, to add nuance, to complicate, to show facts that aren't necessarily being considered. So a lot of times, historically, when minority groups have advocated for themselves, there was a presumption they had a higher bar to prove in the public that their facts were legitimate or that their opinions were legitimate. And I think, you know, social media has allowed them to show that's actually happening, to show to show these things are real.
Lydia, your thoughts on combating all these isms and ias that plague our society?
Definitely, well, definitely with more speech, not with less speech. I definitely want to know what people are thinking. I don't want them being polite to me and saying, I mean, a lot of people now know how to be polite, but they haven't really thought through various issues. So definitely more speech, more art, rather than less.
And we could take another question. We've got time for.
I just want to add something, Lisa.
I apologize.
I was just going to say, you know, I think that, you know, free speech in a democracy does not exist in a vacuum. There are other elements of a democracy that need to be valued and supported in order to make free speech a functioning reality. And I think part of that is so addressing those isms involves, in my opinion, why is it that the Amy Cooper incident has not been captured before? That is the role of the media, right? That is the role of the media to report on those kinds of stories. So the fact that we had to wait for social media for there to be an openness to hear those personal narratives that have happened over time is also a reflection of our failure, and maybe there's a gentler word, but to do the job, which is reporting what's happening and reporting it because we know it's happening, because our eyes and ears are in places outside of the specific worlds that we occupy. I think that would go a long way towards addressing those isms that you raised.
Thank you. Thank you. Ange, we could take another question.
Hi, yeah, this one is from Leona. For much of Canadian history, the prevailing wisdom legitimated racism, terrible treatment of Indigenous people, discrimination against women, denial of rights to LGBTQ. All of this has been and continues to be challenged, and advances made by marginalized groups whose right to be heard has been protected by our Charter free expression rights. Does not allowing those rights to be undermined ultimately harm marginalized communities the most?
Thank you for that question. It's an important question. Abbas, your thoughts?
Sure. Marginalized and minority communities will always suffer the cost of liberty. If the cost of liberty is eternal vigilance, it's always suffered by minorities and marginalized groups. That I don't think, I think historically, I can't think of an oppressed majority, really. Well, you could argue maybe Quebec in the 70s. But that cost, I think, is always going to be there. I think the question is who becomes the arbiter of those civil liberties? And I think that's where I think our discussion kind of is. Is it somewhere? I'm uncomfortable with the state arbiter of speech, even though it may come at the cost of other liberties. And it's easier if we had an example to kind of work with.
I think we could take where Donald Trump, just this week, for example, was at least, talking. The dog of the week was, maybe it's time to shut down these social media companies, which was a way of him saying, maybe it's time for me to shut down all the social media. So there you have a person in a position of power who used to be the arbiter of what is acceptable speech in the U.S. And I'm not sure that would get equality-seeking groups any further ahead. Quite the contrary. So if we could use
100%.
that.
I agree with that. And he did that in response to, I think Twitter was suggesting that they're going to put a disclaimer on some of his tweets that these haven't been fact checked. And I think, that's the exact issue, is you're allowing, a person in government to be the arbiter based on, if you got upset on something or not.
Sonya or Lydia, yes, go. I want to come back to you because maybe I misheard the question, but I think part of this question was the idea that the kind of flourishing of democratic ideals that perhaps creates speech that can be harmful to equality-seeking groups is also the same freedom of speech that can allow those groups to speak up.
Yeah, I agree with that. I wouldn't agree with the premise that Canada is an evil colonizing empire that keeps doing evil to minorities. I don't subscribe to that view of its history. I think it's more push and pull. I think it's very imperfect liberal democracy that's slightly getting better, then goes back and slightly getting better and getting more people into the personhood, as we remember the person case. And it's incredibly complicated. It doesn't gel as a country. It doesn't have very many myths about itself. And I think it's a very interesting project, to tell you the truth. I would never call it an evil colonizing empire. And the point that you raised is we benefit as minorities, as equity-seeking groups, we benefit from this playing field. We used to. I recently watched a play which was made about 30, 40 years ago. It's called Taking Liberties by a playwright called Dave Covey. And it was written about free speech back then and free speech debates back then. And most of the obstacles placed on these characters' free expression was from the right wing. So you have a character of teenager who insists on reading Margaret Lawrence, even though her school board says that's immoral, you can't read Margaret Lawrence. And then you have a gay guy who doesn't want his name revealed after about how straight and various other things. So we absolutely must not forget that we as minorities and various sequencing groups, we have benefited, and we just think we should keep the eye on the ball and just not say everything is evil with the system. We cannot ever participate in it. I think we should be more nuanced. Yeah.
Before I go to you, Sonya, I just do want to apologize to the person who had posed the question that Ange just asked, because I believe, again, because of some lagging internet, I may have miscast or mischaracterized that question. So apologies on that front. But Sonya, is there anything you would like to build on here based on what you've heard from Lydia and Abbas?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is that I think who is impacted by history, a country's historical policies, etc., is an important part of this conversation. So I think, the fact that Canada's policy towards Indigenous communities inspired some to sort of create the architecture for apartheid in South Africa. I mean, that's certainly is really problematic colonial history, and those of us who have colonial histories in other places understand the deep and the deep impact of colonialism. It's not something that you can erase quickly, right? And it impacts the new systems that get created, and it takes a lot of willingness to actually confront the problem, to actually address it. So I also think that as immigrants with a certain amount of privilege, and I think immigrants to Canada have a very different experience from second generation, third generation, fourth generation people who have longer histories here and perceive things differently. And I think all of those are the complexities of Canadian ecosystem that make it difficult to find, which is where the nuance is so important. So, I mean, I think that marginalized communities should absolutely be like the concerns that we should be discussing when we discuss reframing and addressing some of these issues should have the problems of the most affected at the core. And I think that, just saying that will, history will sort it out and over time things will improve is not really good enough to my ears. And so, I mean, I think that there's a lot of work to do. And I come back to having making sure that there are reparations, that there is a way of addressing historical, patterns of exclusion. And there's a way to do that and not just do it in a token way. And I think a lot of what happens in Canada in these processes tends to be token and doesn't really allow for a genuine new explosion of ideas. That being said, yes, I agree with Lydia. Canada, fascinating experiment and a great new place to have this kind of exchange of great ideas across very deep, complex and different communities. And I also believe free speech is at the heart of it, but I don't think it's an isolation of some of the other important aspects that we discussed here today.
Sorry, Sonya, I am going to have to leave it there just because I'm mindful of the clock. I it's a little too long, and I have to hand back to Jim Turk. Sorry, I usually let people get to their last thought, but I have to. We have a hard out at 3:30, I believe. So Jim, it's yours. Thank you, friends.
Thank you so much.
Well, let me thank the three panelists and our moderator for a very engaging and enlightening discussion. We're really happy that you agreed to be with us today, and I would like to thank the audience for their participation and their questions, and to remind you that the next panel in the CFE virtual forum series will be next Tuesday, June 2nd at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and the topic is it time to re-examine limits on workplace free expression? There are probably few places in Canada where expression is more limited than in the workplace. What are those limits? Which of those limits are justified and which aren't? I mean, we're seeing now with what's happening in long-term care homes that much of what's been going on, the staff and family of residents have known about that, but the restrictions on their ability and right to speak about that without penalty or without reprisal is virtually non-existent. So there are a lot of issues we have to talk about with regard to expression in the workplace and related to the workplace, and that'll be the topic of our next forum. If you want more information about this or about any of our other forums or to hear the previous ones, please go to the CFE website, which is cfe.ryerson.ca. And again, thank you to the panel and our moderator.